Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We've heard a little bit about different aspects of decarbonisation already this morning and earlier today, and now we're going to hear about magnetite's role in that. And I'm joined here with Tim Dobson, the Managing Director of Magnetite Mines. Good afternoon, Tim.
G'day, Andrew. Great to be here, and thanks for everyone for attending this session.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Tim, Magnetite Mines' flagship Razorback iron ore project is positioned as a key enabler of low-carbon steelmaking. Can you outline this project and what it's designed to support, and the global shift to green steel and decarbonisation in the steel value chain?
Yep, certainly. I'll try to keep it into a thumbnail, but the opportunity for the green iron industry in Australia is quite a phenomenal one. The South Australia's geological landscape hosts over 18 billion tonnes of magnetite ore. It's been known about for a long time. The project that we're going to develop was discovered almost 100 years ago as a potential iron ore resource, but it's still in the ground. It has not been economic up until now, until the decarbonisation agenda. Now, magnetite can be concentrated by taking advantage of its magnetic properties at the mine site and produce a very high-grade, pure iron ore raw material supply for green iron and green steel making. Why does it need to be so high purity? Because in the direct reduced iron electric arc furnace route for steel making, which currently accounts for about 5% of the world's steel production, there is no slag tap, which means there's no way to get impurities out. So what goes into an EAF, electric arc furnace, comes out in the steel product. So to make high quality steels, you need to have high quality pure raw material. So that's the starting point. So all of a sudden, magnetite is at a premium because this is the new iron units that are needed for electric arc furnace steel making. Now, not all magnetite projects are endowed with the ability to make that high purity. In Western Australia, for example, there are 3 large magnetite projects already running. There's one in Whyalla and there's another one in Tasmania. So there's actually 5 magnetite projects in Australia. None of them are supplying a grade that will feed the direct reduced iron or electric arc furnace market. They're all supplying coal-based blast furnace steelmaking. The South Australian deposits are geologically different and are therefore able to be, in our case, make a very high purity product. So, what needs to happen to create a green iron industry is that we need to stand up some of these new high quality projects such as ours. We have the Razorback iron ore project. It's about 240 kilometres north-northeast of Adelaide as the foundational step for a supply chain that will supply decades of feed into a green iron industry. If that green iron industry does not emerge in Australia, our product will be shipped to where it does emerge, places like the Middle East, Europe, and potentially places like Brazil and Canada, which also have competing magnetite resources and high renewable energy resources as well. So that was the other aspect of it. Australia's not the only place that has an endowment of good quality magnetite and renewable energy. We're in competition with other countries. And at the moment, those other countries are actually getting the investment, and Australia is playing a catch-up game. So that's really the thumbnail of where we stand. Yeah,
thanks, Tim. And I understand one of the project's advantages is its proximity to renewable energy infrastructure in South Australia. So how is Magnetite Mines planning to leverage that as part of its, reducing operational emissions and so on?
So Australia has 2 comparative advantages against its competitors, and there are others that have them as well, as I just mentioned. But one is magnetite, but the other one is, of course, renewable energy. So what the concept of green iron is, we produce a product using renewable energy that's then embedded into a very transportable metal briquette that's easily shipped, and that's embedded renewable energy that's being sold to a third-party country that needs the metal and has not got renewable energy. So it's buying the renewable energy in an easily shipped product. Now, South Australia has led the way, not only in Australia, but in most jurisdictions in the world, in going to a gigawatt-scale grid that's now with a very high penetration of wind and solar and battery, to the point where they're now in the high 70% and are on track to be at 100% net renewable energy on the grid in South Australia by 2027, which is 2 years away. that gives that state a particular advantage because it has 19 billion tonnes of magnetite. We've got 6 billion of that just in our 2 tenements packages. And it gives us access to the grid, and we intend to tap into the grid and access renewable energy from day one to run our concentrator, which will have about 150 megawatt load to process this magnetite into a saleable concentrate product. So that is an outstanding foundation for the delivery of this green iron dream.
And just in terms of use of renewable energy, just the proportion of emissions in the mining process and beneficiation process versus the DR process, can you comment on that?
Certainly. So when you look at the steel carbon footprint from all of the steps, from the digging it up the rock in the pit to the pouring the last billet at the steel maker, there is one step, there's about 10 steps in that chain, there's one step that produces 80% of the carbon emissions. And that's where you rip the oxygen molecule off the iron ore molecule. All iron ores are iron oxides. And so coal is currently used for 70% of the world's iron ores, and it strips the carbon, the oxygen off the iron ore molecule, and it goes up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. If you replace that with natural gas, you've got hydrogen and carbon molecules, so they're both doing the job. Some's producing steam, H2O, and some's producing CO2. When you go to pure hydrogen, there's no carbon left, and you're only producing steam. So this is where the difference is in the steel making. So that one step accounts for 80%. So when you look at, if you decarbonise your trucks at the pit, and you decarbonise the train taking it to the port, you decarbonise the ship, you decarbonise the concentrator, you're dealing with the other 20%. But the big bang for the buck is that 80%. And the salient point I would make here is this is the way that Australia has a win-win. We not only make a lot of money by selling green iron to our North Asian, in particular, demand that is emerging because they're putting EAFs in, but we're helping them decarbonise. We're going to punch above our weight in global decarbonisation. There's always an argument in Australia that why should we decarbonise when we're only this much of the world's problem? Well, here we can now take care of this much of the world's problem and make money doing it. That's a key point, which is why there is so much enthusiasm in the quarters that understand this point for this new industry.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just looking at different aspects now, so we've seen a lot of regulatory and policy changes, both at state and federal level over the last little while. So how is the evolving regulatory and policy framework and indeed investor expectations shaping your decarbonisation strategy?
So a shout out, I guess, to the Malinowskis government. I've been very impressed with the current government in South Australia, and we've got a great relationship as a company with all levels of government in SA, but led by Peter Malinowskis, identified that the hydrogen jobs plan that he came into the last election with, the dream there was to sell hydrogen into Europe, and it was quickly realised that it was a bit of a fantasy. And then it came to the realisation that why don't we use our hydrogen for green iron? So the state government policy shifted quite dramatically last year to come up with a green iron and steel strategy for the state to back up the hydrogen jobs plan. They commenced an expression of interest process called the Green Iron Opportunity. There were 53 large submissions, of which ourselves and our consortium partners joined on. And they've also last year introduced the HRE Act, which brought about 4 or 5 different regulatory acts together into one. So it became a one-stop shop for new renewable energy and hydrogen zones to make it a much easier pathway to approval to provide those key inputs into making green iron. So that's an impressive track record in a very short period of time by a government. On the federal side, as I mentioned before, we've been a little bit of a laggard. I compare us to the Canadian government. The Canadian, both federal and provincial governments, have been putting policy and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into their iron ore and steel industry consistently over the last 5 years, and the money is going there. So Nippon Steel, Sojitz from Japan just invested $245 million in a big magnetite project in Newfoundland earlier this year. Vale, the big iron ore miner from Brazil, invested in another big magnetite project in Quebec, or Newfoundland as well, the Iron Bear project. That's where the money's going because the policy shifted there. Now, what we saw in the federal level is we have a critical minerals system that's run by the Federal Resources Minister, Madeleine King, and we have an industry minister that presides over the green metals agenda for Australia, which is aluminium and green iron in particular. Those two are two separate ministries. Now, magnetite sits in the middle there. Now, we made a very strong submission to the federal government 2 years ago when the critical minerals public submissions were opened that high purity iron should actually be added to the critical minerals list because of this green iron opportunity and our comparative advantages. Canada did that 2 years ago, and that's where the money's going. We have not done that. And the critical minerals that we talked about in the last 2 days here are all about all the other metals, but magnetite is talked about separately because it's attached to an industry minister and a green iron agenda. So that locks us out from government funding because we're not a critical mineral, and the other policy support that comes with that. So there's a bit of a gap there at the federal level is what I would say, and my message there would be that we need to bring these together.
And is there a closing window of opportunity to catch up, to plug that gap, so that, or is there going to be a point of no return where it would be impossible for us to catch up?
Good point. There's a lot of transition to do, but when the investments are made, they're made for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So these are long-term supply chains into the steel industry because it's such a big industry. 1.8 billion tonnes of steel is made every year. So when a Nippon Steel, for example, invests $245 million in the Kami magnetite project in Newfoundland, that's then to be turned on a mine that will be there for the next 50 years, supplying them. And they don't need to go to another mine then, they've got it locked in there. So if we miss those key early mover investments from particularly North Asian and Indian steel makers, then we could be locked out for quite some time.
Tim, how does your decarbonisation strategy help with your social licence to operate, particularly in terms of, community engagement and regional development and so on? Does it give you a leg up being potentially in the green iron or decarbonisation space?
I think it does. So the Malinowskis government also identified that what we called the Rust Belt towns of the Upper Spencer Gulf, we're talking about Whyalla, Port Augusta and Port Pirie, are at the end of their life from their traditional old industries, and the State Prosperity Plan was devised under the South Australian government last year to enrich the future of those three jurisdictions by bringing new industry in, and we've seen that built excitement through those communities. And how do we know that? He actually ran town halls at all those jurisdictions, and ran a series of town halls through Adelaide because most of his voter base is in Adelaide, so he has to convince his electorate that the money is well spent in the Upper Spencer Gulf. But he's identified green iron, hydrogen, copper and water supply as four big key industries to replace the old coal power station, the old blast furnace, and of course Nearstar's living on government funds at the moment in Port Pirie. So what we see when we talk to community, and we've spent a lot of time in stakeholder management engaging and getting supportive communities at Peterborough and Port Pirie, which are near our project, and we talk to pastoralists, we saw what started out as scepticism turn into enthusiasm when people realised that they could not only get jobs and stability for their children and their future generations that live in this area, but they can do it in a future-facing industry and not an old, dying industry that's based on fossil fuels. So it certainly has helped in that respect.
Yeah, excellent. Are there any emerging technologies or process innovations that you see as perhaps game changers in your space?
Yes, there's numerous efforts around the world to find a way to make green iron that's not necessarily with DRI, so there's a whole bunch of technologies. So some of those, usually they're 20 to 40 year gestation periods for novel technologies to come to commercialisation. So in the meantime, it's DRI EAF. This already is producing 5% of the world's steel. Well-known technologies. They all use natural gas at the moment, and in some cases DRI use pulverised coal. But we can start with natural gas, and then as hydrogen becomes available, you just mix it in with the natural gas, and eventually you want to get to pure hydrogen. At the mine site, will be attached to the grid, so we've already taken care of the big load on the concentrator with renewable energy, but we have diesel trucks, for example, in the pit when we get going would be the traditional way, and you have a diesel train to train it to the coast. You have a diesel ship taking it, so those logistics legs do have a carbon footprint. I would applaud Fortescue. Just in the last couple of weeks, $4 billion commitment to battery electric haul trucks for their big iron ore operations. That's a big call by Andrew Forrest and his team to commit to a fully electric battery-operated truck fleet. That'll be a new one. By the time our project comes into operations in around 5 years' time, Hopefully that technology's well advanced and embedded, and we'll be able to access those decarbonised logistics to go with our decarbonised concentrator. But as I said, the main game is actually providing a reduced product for our downstream Scope 3 emitters.
Yeah, that's where your biggest impact will be.
That's the biggest impact for the planet.
Yep. And so what does success look like for magnetite mines in 5 to 10 years from here, from a decarbonisation perspective and from the company's perspective generally?
Yep, so we hear the collaboration word is thrown around a lot, and when I took this role on in 2022, I could see immediately that the technical challenges of building this mine and getting our product into the market and then establishing a foundation for this new industry wasn't really the risk for the project. The risk is in the scale. It's very, very large. We have to mine a lot of material, process a lot of material, and then ship a lot of material to market. And secondly, there's a lot of players involved. We have big utility operators we have to deal with, bringing in power and water. We have to deal with logistics operators, and the power operators have to deal with renewable energy providers. We have to have off-takers that are committed to green iron agendas, so there's big relationships with international trading groups and steelmakers. And of course, there's the community engagement, both at the local, at the state, and then at the federal level as well. So the complexity of bringing this together is the number of big players that have to come together in an aligned way to bring this together, a brand new industry for Australia, which will provide untold jobs and prosperity, but it's complex because of the relationships, and everyone's agenda has to be aligned. So we've spent a lot of our time doing exactly that, building supportive relationships, educating people of what the game is, what the end game is, and then supporting those relationships to bring them together with aligned thinking. So the collaboration is the hard bit. So success for us will be government support at the federal level, as I described before, and secondly, locking in our long-term offtake partners that are committed to a long-term green steel agenda and need decades worth of green iron supply, or even just our concentrate supply. That's what success will look like.
Sure. And any immediate priorities for magnetite mines?
Yep, I'm securing funding at the moment. So last year we signed a non-binding heads of agreement with JFE Shoji. So JFE is the second biggest steel maker in Japan after Nippon Steel. Shoji means trading, so that's their trading arm. So they provide raw materials into JFE Steel. They're all under one big holding company on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So we've signed them up as a partial funding partner for the funds that I need to bring this project to an FID. I'm currently securing a second partner to co-invest alongside them. And that's my main priority right now.
Yeah. And infrastructure corridors, is that on the horizon as well for you?
Yeah, the state government's been talking about infrastructure corridors for quite some time, so we've helped crystallise them. We've developed our own ideas. We've actually got a pathway for our transmission line. We've got good relationships with all the landowners on that pathway, so there's a natural corridor we've already developed on our own. But the other corridor for us is on the way to Port Pirie. There's a railroad there, so there's a rail corridor. That's the natural place to bring a water pipeline up from the coast. And we've had some success on both of those fronts with the state government, for example, helping us lobby AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, to bring forward a new transmission line corridor directly past where our project goes to open up new renewable energy zones. Transmission corridors are the slow point in renewable energy. I think everyone can see that. There is lots of renewable energy zones in Australia, but they're mostly in places where there's no place to plug into the grid. So getting new transmission lines is critical, and we've been able to bring forward a major transmission line into the project planning phase with AEMO, not just us, but others and others, and the state government support. The other one I would mention is the state government infrastructure strategy for South Australia. For the first time introduced a new recommendation just 6 months ago when it was adopted by the Premier for a water supply pipeline into the Braemar Iron Formation where our project is located for multi-user water supply to help bring these up. These are the logical areas that government should support new provinces and new industry that will create untold jobs. Where does government support? In policy and in infrastructure. So they're the two.
Well, thanks, Tim. I think that's just about all we've got time for. So thank you very much for your thoughts and sharing your insights into magnetite mines.
Happy to talk about it. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you.